is Leslie with NASS. I want to thank you for joining us. We have, how many people on here right now? Right now we've got 86 people on the WebEx, so that's amazing. I want to go ahead. This has been a topic that has sort of occupied a lot of our time over the last couple of years, remote notarization, and now we're expanding with the executive orders to remote and paper notarizations. And so I have asked a bunch of people to participate in this workshop, leaving us enough time for the states at the end to ask questions, because I think there are a lot of questions out there on this topic. So first up, I have an overview of state laws and executive orders. And I have Bill Anderson, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs with the National Notary Association, and Kathleen Butler, who is the Executive Director of the American Society of Notaries. And they have sent me their PowerPoint, so I am going to get that up. All right, does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. Leslie, you can go to the next slide, the first slide, please.
I'm working on it. Oops.
There we go. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Well, the purpose of this slide is to provide the context for the 2020 remote bills and state legislatures that Kathleen will be discussing here in a moment. This data goes back to 2011, so you can see the trends over time. Not all state legislatures were in session in 2020, but the number of tracked bills and enactments is greater this year than in prior years. These numbers include all of the temporary COVID-19 measures that we will discuss later. Without them, the numbers would be lower overall. The NNA tracks a lot of bills that affect notaries and notarization each year. This year, and for the last couple of years, remote notarization has been the biggest issue. But we also tracked bills related to notaries in the elections process, notary standards of practice, notarized documents like powers of attorney, commission changes, electronic signatures, and many others. Approximately 1/3 of the bills this year were on remote notarization, including both permanent and temporary COVID-19 measures. The other 2/3 dealt with other notary matters, and just over 1/3 of the enactments were also on matters related to remote notarization. Leslie, next slide, please, and Kathleen, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Leslie and Bill. So this slide provides a high-level look at 2020 remote notarization legislative activity. Bills were considered in 16 states, and I'll name them from east to west: Alaska, Hawaii, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Louisiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey. First, I'll mention the fails. Connecticut's legislation was introduced in March of 2020. It was referred to committee, but ultimately failed when the legislature adjourned in May. In New Jersey, the governor absolute vetoed a permanent RON bill. In his veto message, the governor stated that New Jersey needed a measure more precisely tailored to address notarization challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. This led to the subsequent introduction, passage, and signing of AB 3903, which is a temporary RON measure that will expire upon lifting of New Jersey's executive order declaring its state of emergency and public health emergency. But elsewhere in the US, 2020 brought 5 permanent enactments of remote notarization. Those were in Wisconsin, effective May 2020. Louisiana, with a bill effective date of August 1, 2020, but also establishing varied effective dates for RON contingent on passage of the proposed federal RON bill, the Secure Notarization Act. Then we had Missouri, effective August 28 of 2020, Colorado, effective August 28 Colorado effective December 31st, 2020, and Alaska effective January 1, 2021. There's a sixth possible enactment, which will be in Hawaii if the governor signs the bill on his desk. So Leslie, next slide, please. Thank you. So this visual shows how widely RON enactments are spread across the country, and it does not reflect any temporary RON authorizations related to COVID-19 actions. States with permanent RON statutes are either dark or light blue. The dark blue states indicate where RON is in effect today. The lighter blue states indicate where it's authorized, but with a future effective date. And here's a little bit of detail on those with a future effective date. First of all, we have Alaska, effective January 1, 2021. And I thought I'd mention whether or not some of these future effective dates and enactments will involve rulemaking. So in Alaska, that enactment does authorize rulemaking by the Lieutenant Governor. Next, we have Washington, effective October 1, 2020. It authorizes rulemaking by the Department of Licensing. Then Colorado, effective December 31st, 2020, also authorizes rulemaking by the Secretary of State. We have Missouri, effective August 28 of 2020, and that measure was only just signed on July 6th of 2020, and it's, as Bill likes to call it, the biggest notary bill ever. This one authorizes rulemaking by the Secretary of State. Louisiana's enactment created various effective dates for RON, as I mentioned, contingent on whether the proposed federal RON bill is enacted. Rulemaking by the Secretary of State is required, and rules must be adopted by February 1, 2022. Then we have Vermont. The RON enacting legislation was actually effective July 1, but it conditions RON on standards adopted by rules of the Secretary of State, and those are still pending. And finally, there's Maryland. Its enactment is effective October 1, 2020, and it authorizes rulemaking by the Secretary of State. And on to you, Bill.
Thank you, Kathleen. Leslie, next slide, please. Thank you. We're going to turn to COVID-19 now. This slide summarizes all the COVID-19 actions that have been taken by the states so far this year. We've lumped them into four buckets: executive orders, temporary legislation, temporary regulations, and guidance. In 27 states, governors issued executive orders on matters related to COVID-19. All but one related to remote ink signed or online notarization. In Florida, the order was actually an administrative order issued by the Florida Supreme Court. Now, this bucket is a state count. There have actually been more than 27 executive orders issued. Some governors have gone back and issued multiple follow-up orders to extend the expiration or the sunset of their remote authorizations. 11 states' legislatures enacted temporary legislation on matters related to remote ink signed or online notarization. And six secretaries of state have issued temporary or emergency rules or regulations on remote ink signed or online notarization. The last bucket is official guidance. Now, typically, if a state commissioning official issues guidance, they usually publish it in their state notary public handbook. In the past, commissioning officials haven't issued a lot of formal guidance that is published outside of their notary handbooks. But this year, it's been an exception. There have been 16 states who have done so. One last observation about this information. Many states took actions in more than one bucket. To give you just one example, the Colorado governor in late March issued an executive order on remote notarization that was followed up immediately by Secretary Griswold issuing emergency regulations or rules to implement that order. Then late last month, the Colorado General Assembly, in their permanent remote bill that they enacted, included provisions for performing remote acts during the interim period between the date the bill was signed and when the permanent RON provisions take effect in December of this year. Leslie, next slide, please. Thank you. Our final slide shows the four main trends of these COVID-19 actions. I'm going to present the two on the left and Kathleen, the two on the right. They're color-coded because they relate to each other. Obviously, remote ink sign notarization is the main trend of these COVID-19 actions and indisputably is the notary issue of the year. It has allowed the public to access notary services during the pandemic and has mitigated the public health risks of face-to-face meetings between the notary and document signers. Now, there's a second trend that's related to remote ink sign notarization. After several governors issued their executive orders, questions arose about whether governors have the authority to set aside statutory laws on physical presence and put in place temporary rules for remote notarization. So, legislatures in 4 states so far, Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, and Louisiana, enacted provisions either approving or validating these notarizations during the time in which they were authorized. Now, there are validation clauses in many states' notary statutes. They are important for down the road when a notarization is challenged or results in a lawsuit. If your governor has issued an executive order for remote notarization, it may be worth considering enacting a validation clause. Kathleen?
Thank you. So the next two trends provide some valuable perspective. When a pandemic creates the urgent need for documents like wills and powers of attorney to be signed, a temporary RIN authorization is maybe just part of the solution. With governmental functions either scaled back or suspended, notaries can't complete the steps to file or renew their commissions timely, and document signers can't renew the credentials needed to satisfactorily identify themselves to a notary. We know of several state actions that helped address these particular challenges. By executive order, California, Maryland, Michigan, New York, and Tennessee either extended expiring notary commissions to a future date certain, or they extended expiring commissions by temporarily waiving the statutory term of commission. In some circumstances, multiple executive orders were issued in order to further extend a prior extension. 2 other states, again, that we know of, gave relief to notaries by extending statutory deadlines for filing their oath, their bond, or meeting any other in-person requirement to obtain a new or a renewal notary commission. Those states were North Carolina, which did this by legislation, and Pennsylvania. The Secretary of State requested and received a gubernatorial waiver to extend its commission filing deadline. Nearly every state authorized extensions of driver's licenses. Many extensions were granted through executive order, but there were multiple other mechanisms. Now, while it's logical to assume that a notary could accept an expired license that has been extended by some state authorization, it's a tremendous help when the commissioning officer issues guidance clarifying whether a notary may actually do that and remain compliant with state-specific signer identification requirements. Commissioning officers in 3 states that we know of issued guidance: California, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. So kind of the thought that comes to us is, if we ever suffer another nationwide challenge like the COVID-19 crisis, we've learned just from these 2 issues that while RIN authorizations command a lot of attention, emergency orders and authorizations affect notaries in other ways that are just as influential in maintaining the public's access to a notary's vital services during a pandemic or any other national crisis. And that concludes our report. Bill, I'll turn it back over to you for anything else that you'd like to add. And if not, then thank you very much for allowing us to share all of that information with you.
Thank you, Kathleen and Bill. I have a couple of notes in the chat. First is Iowa passed a remote bill last year, and the governor did an executive order as well. I think that might have maybe conflicted with one of your charts. And the other one is we already have a remote notary statute in New Mexico, but it's quite limited.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay, moving on. Our next presenter is Kobe Pruitt. He is the Associate Director, State Government Affairs for the Mortgage Bankers Association, and he's going to be joined by Elizabeth Blosser, who is the Senior Director of Government Affairs for the American Land Title Association, and they're going to talk a little bit about the Model Emergency Executive Order on Notarization that their organizations have jointly supported. Kobe, you want to take it away?
Thanks, Leslie. I'm actually going to let Elizabeth start, and then I'm going to get into a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of what RIN is.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much, Leslie. I want to start out by talking a little bit about where the title and lending industries have been. Like many other industries, COVID changed things overnight for us. Our industries were considered essential services, so obviously our members had to go to work right away to try and figure out how do we safely continue to conduct closings. And obviously that's important from a couple of different standpoints. Real estate is a huge part of the economy, but from a logistical standpoint, you also have people who've maybe sold a house and their house is already sold and they need to move into another house, or their moving truck is full of all of their goods and they need to go someplace. Beyond that, we have these sort of record interest rates, low interest rates. And so a lot of people have wanted to, during this time, take advantage of refinancing, which puts a lot of extra money per month into people's pockets. So it's been really important to keep those real estate transactions going from our industry perspective. And I kind of want to give you a little bit of an idea of that. So when we all met last time and have talked in the past, from our industry's perspective, we thought digital closings are something that is coming. We've all got a timeline for it. We're doing the implementation steps. Well, COVID-19 sort of just moved everybody's timeline up. The American Land Title Association did a survey in the beginning of May to all of our members, and we found that 30% of our members are doing some type of digital closing right now. That was up from 17% at the end of last year.
I'm sorry, and Bill Anderson too.
And I'm sure that those numbers have only increased. Anecdotally, we hear, companies are coming on board with remote notarization and digital closing options continually. And so as we continue to look towards the future, one of our big issues is how do we have more access to remote closing options for folks. And so there's a couple of things that we've been interested in as an association. One has been working with our state associations and all of you to pass laws in the state, as Kathleen and Bill outlined, whether that be RUONA 2018 or the MBA Alta model. We've also been supporting on the federal level, the Secure Notarization Act. But beyond that, just thinking about the short term, we're very interested in these emergency orders related to notarization and what they can do. A lot of our state associations met with many of you, met with governors early on to try and get these emergency orders in place. And we've been really grateful that they've been available, because not only do they keep consumers safe, they also keep our members and their employees in a safe closing environment. Looking forward, we decided to partner with MBA and the National Association of Realtors to put together model language for an executive order on notarizations. So you may wonder, why did we do that now, and why choose to do it at all? And there's three main reasons for that. The first is we wanted there to be model language out there that allowed for all of the different types of notarizations. So, we hear about RIN and RON. Some of the orders only related to RIN, some only to RON. So we wanted to make sure there was language out there that allowed for the different types of remote notarizations that are being utilized. Second, we wanted to promote some uniformity. Uniformity in these types of situations often makes it a lot easier for compliance, especially for companies that operate in multiple states. It makes it easier to adopt from state to state some of these remote closing options. And finally, we wanted to really ensure legal certainty. As Bill and Kathleen talked a little bit, nobody wants to have a situation where we go back and we find that, some of these notarizations that happen during this period are being called into question. Nobody wants, any questions about the validity of these notarizations. So that was really our third big pillar for putting together this model language. We did have the benefit of looking at all of the orders that were out there when we put this model together. We think not only did we sort of accomplish our 3 goals, but the language that's out there also addresses concerns about how do you get these documents that are notarized this way recorded in the local land records so that you have that constructive notice happening. And then it also deals with some of the questions related to interstate recognition. I'm going to, at this point, turn it over to Kobe to talk about RIN versus RON, but just from our industry's perspective, please know that both RIN and RON are being used in transactions today for real estate transfer. Over to you, Kobe.
Right, and thanks. And we just want to reiterate, from, I think I can speak for both MBA and Alta, that, although RIN and RON are both out there, we really do encourage individuals to pursue RON avenues when you're looking to either through statute or executive order try to allow for remote notarizations because of the amount of kind of protections for consumers and just kind of the legal certainty that is associated with RON transactions that we're seeing. And the reason why, because we're talking about RIN, what is RIN? How is it different from RON? And just to give you kind of like an overview of what RIN is, it's really, it's like, as we said, it's authorizing temporary, remote notarizations through executive order, in some cases legislation, with some time of sunset date, usually associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And really what RIN is just the suspension of the in-person requirement that is in notarial law in a lot of states. So it's just using, audio-visual technology, the Skypes, Facebooks, whatever you can do as create a kind of a webcam situation where you can do identity verification, ID proofing, and it's very similar to what you would do in an in-person notarization. It's not, and our concern is that it's done using unsecured audio-visual technology like the Facebooks, like the Skypes. And like I said, very limited when it comes to credential analysis, ID proofing. It's really tantamount to just waving your ID in front of a webcam without much more verification beyond that. Again, it's not and then it's also not completely an online process like RON. RIN in most states, most cases, requires you still either fax or email a original copy of the document that's signed by the principal to the notary for recordation purposes that you can then put in the file. So it's not like RON, which is a completely online process where you have an online, an electronic seal or stamp of some kind, and it requires electronic signatures. And like I said, the final package really just looks the same because you are sending that document in for recording purposes. And our big concern with RIN is that, currently and farther down the line, we're happy that the GSEs have, provided RIN guidance to kind of help us understand what they would accept. but long term, the insurability and saleability of RIN is just really not there. As when it comes to Ron, you know, we've worked as an industry really hard to make sure all of the experts, all the stakeholders have had a say in creating some of these national models. The ones that, you know, NBA Alta has created, the one, you know, the model standards that NASS has created. These are well thought out, well vetted standards that, you know, are being adopted across the states, and which is why we encourage, you know, individuals to go towards the RON route. Even though our model allows for both RIN and RON, we want to provide that, you know, kind of, you know, versatility during the pandemic. But at the end of the day, we think that RON is the way to go. And the GSEs are a little more comfortable. There's a little more legal certainty when it comes to what they're willing to accept. So that's kind of where we are with RIN versus RON. And if you guys have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, and I would just echo Kobe's comments. So in 2017, Alta put out principles for remote online notarization, which many of you have seen. About a month ago, we came out with new principles for remote notarization in general, not just RON, but the various types of remote notarization. And in those, we clearly state any long-term solution needs to include third-party multi-factor authentication to help combat fraud issues. And so really support RIN as a short-term solution to allow access.
And we definitely understand that, you know, RIN is very tantalizing for a lot of groups, right? Because there's not a lot of startup when it comes to trying to get it up and running. RON takes a little bit more time to find a vendor, to, you know, vet them, to get a contract in place, and then to do the RON transactions. And we understand that RIN, you know, especially in attorney closing states, you know, is very advantageous where you can just kind of do remote notarizations without having to go through that entire process. But again, we just say that, you know, when it comes to protecting consumer information, when it comes to making sure things are done in a secured platform, RON is the place to be.
Thank you, Kobe. You dropped out at the last word. RON is
the place to be.
Better.
RON is great. RON is the place to be.
Okay. Okay. Moving on to MISMO certification of remote notarization vendors. Jonathan Kearns is here from MISMO. We'll go through all the questions. After Jonathan finishes up, I think we'll have a fair amount of time to cover questions.
Perfect.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Thank you, Leslie. I am going to go ahead here and show my screen. I just got to. All right. All right. Great. So, as you may or may not know, I believe most of you know already that MISMO came out with remote online notarization standards in September of 2019. So it really gave a best practices guide for platforms on different items such as KBA, credential analysis, record retention, audio video requirements. So the industry, and a lot of you were involved in that, came together and created great standards for remote online notarization platforms to abide by. In addition, those standards support the model legislation that NBA and Alta came up with. So, but what we were seeing is everybody was having to do their own certification process, and the certification process was vastly different. So what we as MISMO did is we created a MISMO remote online notarization certification program. We just launched it in April of 2020. And what its main job is to do is provide clarity and transparency on which RON providers comply with MISMO RON standards. The goal of it is to reduce or even eliminate the resource burden of duplicative assessments and certification programs. So, if your state's doing a deep dive into each platform or is requiring a certification from each RON platform, I encourage you to review this process and see if this can either help reduce the amount of work your state has to do, or even eliminate that. Currently, we have 2 platforms certified already. So eNotaryLog and Notarize have completed their certification process. We have another 4 in progress right now, and we're expecting another 3 to start before the end of the month. So it's been very well received. To see a lot of more information about the program itself, under MISMO.org, there's education and then certification, and there's a specific section called RON domain certification there. So diving into a little bit more details about the information of what the certification entails. It is purely based off of the MISMO RON standards, right? The industry did a great job of defining what they wanted. And so MISMO is not interpreting those in any specific way. We are utilizing those exactly the way that they were written and approved by the industry. It does not verify any state-specific requirements. Again, going back to the top bullet point, because of this remote online notarization standards are generalized and they are not specific to any one state. We're not reviewing any specific state requirements. That being said, we do have the platforms attest to what states they believe they comply with. So it might be something that would be good to say, okay, great, these are the platforms certified and these are the ones who attest to that are in my state, as an example. We do review it annually, so it's not just a one and done. Right? We're going to review it every year to ensure that they still meet them, and because we fully expect those certifications to change, those certification standards to change during the process. In fact, I think the work group has already started discussing modifications to it, because even though they were released in 2019, right, in September 2019, the standards were really developed fully in 2017. So a lot has changed in the industry itself, is a lot more mature. So what is the certification process entail? So first of all, we have them fill out a questionnaire and an attestation. We ask them certain things like, hey, who's your third-party provider for KBA and credential analysis, right? Because the standards are clear that those must be third-party associations. So we ask them certain questions like that. Again, there's certain things that we have them attest to versus things that we're actually going to review and analyze in a live demonstration. And that's the next aspect. We actually go through a live demonstration of all the test case scenarios. So we built an entire set of test cases, both happy path and exception processing against the MISMO standards. One of the examples I like to use in talking about that is the KBA timing out after 2 minutes. If that times out if they haven't answered all the questions with 2 minutes, we need to see it all go through the process again. So those are the type of things that we're watching. So it's been taking us almost 3 hours per demonstration. We've been doing it in 2 90-minute chunks to get all the way through. We also have them submit supporting documentation. So anything of user guides, there's a lot of procedural items in there. So there's a lot of user guides, notary information, how the notary terminates the session, how the notarial record is accessible. We can view some of this stuff, but that we also want to make sure that it's documented, so that way the notary knows how to do it. Just because they can do it doesn't mean they know how. So we watch all that. We also take screenshots of items and create what we call our evidence package. Even though we record the entire session, so that way we have it to go back to review, we take screenshots of different evidence and test case scenarios, so that way we have our own evidence package. And then what we do is we take that entire package, we analyze it and review it. And it's a 2-team effort, right? It's the team who actually did the review and demonstration and put the evidence package together. That team reviews it and gives their preliminary findings. And then there's a secondary team inside MISMO that actually reviews that information and approves or asks questions based off of that. So it's a two-pronged approach. So we feel like we really nailed it in giving a quality assessment for both the users of the platforms, but also the platforms themselves. And then one other thing I would just like to point out, and that being said, I did mention in there, right, that the work group is reviewing the process right now of should we update this. The general consensus thus far is yes, right? It's time to do a thorough review. And that's the last week of August, right before Labor Day kicks off, is the MISMO Summit. We are doing it virtually. So that DWG is meeting. So, you know, and again, anybody can participate in that. So feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in participating in that, or look at our website. The other thing I'd mention is our Digital Mortgage Resource Center, right? So we are in the process of developing a single source for all things digital mortgage. As you can imagine, that's a lofty goal, right? So that is a work in progress. Current information is known RON providers, and in that known RON providers, the reason why I bring this up is in that known RON providers, next to each one, we tell you whether they are MISMO RON certified or whether they are in progress. So you can see that list there of ones that we've collected. It is not a vetted list by any means other than the ones that are through the certification process. So we are going through and going to start vetting them and decide on a protocol of what it takes to be on the list. It has, you know, states that have enacted RON legislation and states that have executive orders or emergency legislation. If any of that information is incorrect, please send us an email at info@mismo.org to help us correct that information. It sounds like there was already some in the beginning, so not saying ours, we're trying to make it as accurate as possible. We had partnered with DLA Piper in order to get that information. So we can blame Margot if it's not correct. Just and and then, like I said, there are already in the future state, we want all things digital, dynamic information, and starting with closings, but we'll do the entire mortgage process itself. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Leslie.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. I have a number of questions in the chat that I'll go through, and then please feel free to ask any questions once I've gone through these that are already online. I would also note, just like everybody else, NASS is keeping a website, and we link to your executive orders or your legislation, any releases that you guys have made about remote online notarization or remote ink notarization. So let me go through some of these questions. Okay, how do you ensure security in RIN as there are no technology requirements? Also, why only one form of ID required? I guess that's either for you or Kobe, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think we both say the same thing, and that is that this is why we're really promoting having the standards that were put in place with RON for any long-term solution. RIN, you know, where you, and the executive orders are certainly very different in terms of what they require for identity verification and things like that. So there, it certainly is kind of lots of different versions out there. But yeah, that is a concern for us as well. Obviously, we're in unprecedented times and trying to, you know, figure out how to create safe environments for people to operate in. But we have those same concerns and think that long term, definitely we need to be looking more to the RON model with the multi-factor authentication.
Great, thank you. So Jonathan, this one's for you. Do the MISMO standards conflict with the RU LONA language? That's the Uniform Law Commission's.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that. I would say from my limited knowledge, that's a no. But Kobe, would you know whether they conflict with them or not?
No, we always try to make sure our standards or our models are consistent with the ULC. We were really big participants in the drafting of the revisions to Relona, and making sure their RON standards were consistent with whatever we were developing for our model, as well as we, made sure, through Michael Neal, who's that First American who helped us kind of craft this, kind of making sure that everything was consistent across the board nationally.
Thank you. Okay, we have serious concerns about the reliance on knowledge-based authentication due to its reliance on data culled from compromised databases, i.e. the Equifax breach. What concerns does this present to the industry, and what other third-party multi-factor authentication tools are being widely used that may be used to satisfy the third-party multi-factor authentication requirement? I guess that's Elizabeth or you, Kobe, or maybe Jonathan, I don't know.
Either or. I'll go ahead and start real quick. This is Jonathan. So I think right there, it is still a multi-factor process. So it's just one item. Listen, there's nothing that's going to be fraud proof. It does have a good database of, and there are more than just Equifax, but every system could be compromised at one sense or another. So if somebody's going to perform that level of fraud, they're going to figure out a way, I would think. But you still have, there's knowledge-based authentication, there's credential analysis, and there's still the tried and true of even in a remote online notarization where they're holding up their driver's license and reviewing that against the person in the video itself. So, it's just not two-factor, it is true multi-factor authentication. Elizabeth and Kobe?
Well, I would just say, we know that KBA is not perfect, but it's kind of the best that we have at this point. Technology is changing so rapidly. I think we'd all agree that, biometrics are a great way to prove who you are. My phone knows who I am by looking at my face or a thumbprint. I just think that there's still questions about how widely you can use that type of biometric data. So I think things will change over time. And I know a lot of the laws that are out there have been written and constructed in such a way to allow for the use of different types of identity verification in the future, including some biometrics. So I think we'll see modifications as time goes by and new technology that we can rely on emerges.
And going to what you're saying, Elizabeth, and that's the reason why MISMO, MBA, and others, we've kept, we were not necessarily silent, but we allowed for room to grow when it comes to how you do multi-factor identification, how you do credential analysis. We didn't want to be too prescriptive in what we required, because then you're trapped in a moment in time and you really can't adapt to, how things change in the industry, how things change in how you do these transactions.
Great, thank you. I'm also getting some, must be people on the phone who are texting me. Where are NBA and ALTA on the federal legislation, on the Secure Act? Where do you stand on that? Did you write it? Inquiring minds want to know.
Once upon a time, we were really well involved in the crafting of the legislation. Again, if you want specific blow by blow, I can connect, either me or Elizabeth connecting you to our lobbyists that, follow this really closely. But, when we started right at the beginning of the pandemic, right, Elizabeth, and we spent a few late nights, drafting the Secure Act. But because politics are politics, things slowly started to shift and change in the way the law was written. We unfortunately found some opposition to the language from the state of California. And, we were trying to work with Feinstein and trying to get the legislation passed, but her Secretary of State and Attorney General were both somewhat against the idea of having Ron in the state or having a federal law that would preempt the way that they do notarization in the state. And they kind of spiked it. And, you know, at the end of the day, the legislation had become, I don't know if the word toothless is the right word, Liz, but it had become so different from the standards that we espoused in the NBA Alta bill, as well as other national standards, that maybe it's, you know, just we're comfortable with where it was and not going forward at this time. But we were, you know, until the very end, we were supportive of getting a federal bill done. I think from our standpoint, both from the NBA and all sides, you know, we both have state campaigns that are going very strongly, you know, and trying to get states to adopt Ron. We're up to what, 26, Liz? And, you know, we are seeing a lot of, you know, we're now over half the country with Ron laws. So I think from our standpoint, we're probably at critical mass where you'll probably see after, you know, things go back to regular order, you might see a lot more states adopting Ron. And that maybe that's for the best, because notarial laws are very state driven. And a lot of, you know, as you guys know, Secretaries of State are very protective of their notarial laws. So, you know, maybe that's for the best.
I'm going to jump in here too. I mean, we've been supportive of Secure Notarization Act. Conversations continue to happen. But one thing I do want to point out is that the purpose of this act has always been as sort of a bridge to when a state could pass their own law. So it was never meant to supersede any state law that was consistent with NBA Alta Model or Rulona 2018. So we've always wanted to make sure that ultimately that power of passing legislation and enforcement went to the states. So
right, and Liz, you're right. It was really about creating legal certainty, and you know, across states.
Okay. How many fraudulent mortgage loans have been funded because a notary failed to properly identify a borrower? And then a follow-up question, how did the loans clear underwriting? I don't know. That's got to be for you, though, because
I don't know if anyone wants to answer that one.
I don't think that there's numbers to provide. The one thing I will say, you know, as you're talking to your constituents and thinking about things, you know, fraud is always a problem, and it's always a concern. And in a pandemic like this, you know, it's an even bigger concern. You know, fraudsters have not taken a break, and so certainly, you know, it's something to always be aware of and thinking about. We run lots of consumer education campaigns. Because, you know, we don't want consumers to end up being victims to a lot of these scams that are happening out there. So it's a threat.
How does RIN-RON executive apply if you already have RON statutes in place? Executive. Oh, orders. How does RIN-RON executive orders apply? All right, so you guys are pushing your model executive order. How does that apply if they've already got at least part of that in place by legislation, statute?
Well, it really depends. So for some of the executive orders, they did an executive order because their RON statute has a future date applied to it. So if it wasn't supposed to go into effect until, you know, say August or September, you know, a executive order allowing for it now was helpful. You know, for a lot of states, maybe already had Ron, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Liz, but Maryland did something similar where they had an executive order that allowed them to have Ron immediately and kind of waive the waiting period that was in between when their statute would come out and or become effective, and using it during the pandemic. So that's why it was, that's how it kind of had it. Some states did executive orders and had Ron laws at the same time.
I would say the model, you can look at the model through the lens of what you need in your state. We again try to check a lot of boxes about, questions on validity and of course acceptability and the ability to implement, because it's great to have these executive orders out there, but if they can't be used in practice, they're not doing what they intended in terms of expanding accessibility. So really taking a look at the model language and what you have, and maybe if it's time for reauthorization, or you want to adjust what you have in place to help in your state, hopefully the language would be of assistance.
Thank you. Okay, someone asked if you could do a little more of an explanation on credential analysis.
Sure. So credential analysis is verifying that the credential is a known good, government issued, whether it's state or federal passports, driver's license. There are applications out there that verify things, the certain little things, the seals on them, the holographics on them, by uploading a picture and verifying it against that database. So that's what credential analysis applications do, verifying that the authenticity of that credential itself, not necessarily identifying the individual. That's more the knowledge base, but the credential itself.
Jonathan mentioned that there are several platforms pending certification. How can we find out the status of platforms that our state has approved?
That's great. So if you go to mismo.org and go to the Digital Mortgage Resource Center, it's right off of the main page there under standards. There's a link that says Digital Mortgage Resource Center. And then you go to RON providers, there's a link there. And there's the list of the RON providers that we know about. And they, next to their names, it'll tell them that they're whether they're certified or whether their certification is in process.
And you said there's just 2 right now, correct?
There's 2 that are certified, and there's 4 others that are currently in the process.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's 6 that have signed up. I believe we're expecting 3 to 4 more by the end of the month.
Okay.
Sign up. And it's interesting. It's interesting because, I've been, prior to Mismo, I was in the digital mortgage space for 20 years, right? Building digital mortgage platforms. Out of the 6, 2 of them I had never heard of. So there are new providers popping up all over. So this becomes even more important now.
Yeah, agreed. Says North Carolina just completed our first RON closing, but most lenders are not moving forward because of the GSE requirement to keep the recording for the life of the loan. What is the expectation that the GSEs, Fannie, Freddie, whatever, will relax the requirement to keep a recording of the transaction for the life of the loan?
I don't know, Kobe, if you want to take this one. Obviously, none of us can speak on behalf of the GSEs, but there's been a lot of conversations about, should it be life of the loan, or should it look something more similar to the NBA Alta model or Relona 2018 that calls for the 10 years. So certainly conversations are happening around that question.
So I recently spoke to the GSEs about this issue, and they are aware it is concerning. This life of loan requirement is out there, especially because of how much it would cost to create additional storage to keep all of these notarization transactions for 30 years or whatever the life of the loan may be. And I've been told that they're having conversations about changing that requirement to something that is more palatable, say more in line with what NBA Alta does, which is 10 years. So those conversations are being had, but the reason why they changed it was, they're allowing for a lot of more states to come online to accept RON without really perfect RON laws in their state. So they saw this as kind of their ability to create some more certainty for themselves, while also allowing for more states to recognize it being states that can do RON. but they do understand that a life of loan requirement is somewhat outside of the realm of what, lenders are willing.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, New Mexico requires, and I don't know if I'm just going to say the letters, ACCET, asset accreditation, to become an e-notary. We are not aware of a third party that will provide this requirement for application purposes. Does anyone know who we might get in contact with to meet this requirement? Does anybody know what an ACCET accreditation is?
Googled
Well,
it.
actually, I do, Leslie. I can simply say that my recollection was when New Mexico adopted their electronic notarization rules over a decade ago. This was part of their rule that they have that applicants for electronic notarization complete an ACCET accredited course. And at that time, the NNA was accredited. When we went to renew it, evidently the process had changed, so we could no longer meet the requirements of ACCET accreditation. And I don't know of any other educational providers that do.
Bill, can you tell me where it is? Who issues an ACCET accreditation?
It's the ACCET is the organization.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to. I don't remember what.
That's okay.
Is
I can,
for. Yeah.
I can look it up. Okay. Anybody have any other questions? All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists who were awesome and informative, and thank you for the over 118 people at one point in time that joined the workshop. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.